May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I'm happy to be back with you again after a different sort of staycation. It brought COVID-19 restrictions, really brings that to a different way of being. One of the things that I did is visited a church that had an outdoor worship service. So I wanted to see what they were doing, hoping that I could probably borrow some things and maybe one day we can have an outdoor service. So I pulled in, there was a section where people could park their cars, another section where you could park and then join people in the grassy area. So I chose to stay in my car. I put the window down, there was a nice breeze. Then I noticed over to my left, there were a couple of the parking ushers were standing there. So I thought, I better be careful. I better put on a mask. So I put on my mask to be safe. But then after the service started, some of their family members joined. So it was about 5 of them sitting in lawn chairs, and that breeze was coming in my direction. So I said, uh-oh, I better put on a better mask. So I put on a mask like this to try to protect myself. But I otherwise enjoyed the worship service. I did notice some things that brought concern. The singers and the preacher and the response to the preacher were not wearing masks. And I was glad that I went when I did, because they announced that the next Sunday they would have worship services back in their sanctuary at 9 and 10:30, not much time in between. I did not feel compelled to go to those services, but glad to have the outdoor experience. So part of my experience while being away, as I mentioned to you in the communication, was to travel to see my mother who was ill. So that in itself was a different type of road trip. My daughter and I drove together, one person driving, the other person in the back seat at an angle. We were committed to wearing masks, and then when we needed a mask break, one of us said, mask break, took our mask off, put the windows down, and allowed that fresh air to come in. Now, from here to Birmingham, where my daughter lives, it's about 3 hours. From Birmingham to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, it's a 9-hour trip, according to Google Maps, but it took us about 11 hours to get there, and then 12 hours coming back. So you can imagine, mask on, mask break, then getting there, staying in separate hotel rooms so that we could have the opportunity to be free from the mask. Then it was very odd to visit my parents, but us wearing masks, them not wearing masks. But it was great to see all of my family nonetheless. My mother's lost a significant amount of weight, but is still, thanks be to God, able to move about and take care of her needs, eat what she can. But the highlight of that trip was when we gathered in the backyard with my sister, brother-in-law, and their family, my parents, and my daughter, and we all had a meal. We last had a meal together at Christmas time, and not knowing if we would be together again. So that definitely was a blessing. No mask, enjoying each other, fresh air. Family is so important. Perhaps you have realized that during this time of COVID-19, how important it is to be with family and friends, and how much we all have taken for granted the ability to move about and do as we please. So the reading from Genesis that we're trailing along this summer reminds us of a family. I love the book of Genesis because of all the stories. And I encourage you, if you've not read it, to read it and take the journey. So we're told that this particular portion begins with Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob, the family of Jacob. Now we remember Jacob's father was Isaac, his mother Rebekah, and his twin brother Esau. Remember, Jacob cheated his brother out of the birthright. Now, Jacob now is an adult, and we know that he is married to Leah and Rachel, and has had children by them, as well as their servants, Bilhah and Zilpah. So Jacob has 12 sons and 1 daughter. But the pericope today is pointing us to Joseph. And we think about Joseph as the dreamer and the son who received a special coat somehow along the way. It's been translated to a coat of many colors, but it's described as a garment with long sleeves. Now, wearing a long sleeve garment back then meant that that person was most likely not going to be involved in any type of work. And because Joseph is the favorite son, that is the case. It's known that Joseph has received this favoritism. And this is passed down from one generation to the next, remembering Jacob was the favorite child of his mother, Rebekah. Things tend to continue on in that way. Now we know that his brothers, the word hated him. That word hate is quite strong, very strong word, hate. It's not more than dislike, it's hate, hatred. And because of their hatred, they decide that when they see him coming, they say, here's this dreamer who's coming. What is excluded from the lectionary are the 2 dreams that Joseph had that he shared with his brothers and with his father. These dreams basically are saying that one day they are going to bow down and worship him. Joseph is 17. So you can imagine these older brothers hearing this. We're going to bow down and worship you. Our father is, already designated you as a favorite son. So when Joseph comes along and they see him, they decide they should kill him. Imagine that. They should kill their brother out of envy and jealousy. But the eldest son, Reuben, says, no, let's not do that. Instead, let's put him in a pit. So when Joseph arrives, because he's going to check on his brothers as his father asked, he's not greeted with any warm welcome. Put yourself in his footsteps. There you are, going to your family members. And they pull his clothes off and throw him down into a pit with no water. And then go ahead and eat outside the pit. They're enjoying food and beverages, and while he's there in the pit after he's traveled a distance to get to them. They decide not to kill him. Instead, they decide to sell him to the Ishmaelites, who they see traveling along the way. And so the Ishmaelites, remember, Ishmael was the son of Abraham, born of Hagar, the servant woman. So it is the Ishmaelites who come along, and they are the ones who carry Joseph into Egypt. And that's where our story concludes for now. But of course, there's much more. Think about how Joseph must have felt being in that pit, put there by his siblings, and then carried away, sold off, having no idea what was going to happen to him. He was no doubt in distress, uncomfortable, fearful, and probably angry to have been treated in such a way. So now let's segue to the gospel reading, where we find that Jesus has fed 5,000 people. But prior to that, he discovers that his cousin, John the Baptist, has been beheaded. And Jesus so wanted to go off to pray, but he takes care of the people, and then he goes off to pray. Jesus is suffering a tremendous loss, a sign of his ministry. John the Baptist, his precursor, has now been killed. So he's praying, and the disciples have gone off. in the boat. And as we just heard in the gospel reading, a storm comes up, and we know this familiar text where Jesus decides not to swim to the boat, not to stand on the shore and wait, but Jesus decides to walk on the water towards them. And of course, they think it's a ghost. Who in the world has seen anybody walking on the water before and since? So Jesus says, do not be afraid, it is I. And Peter, so amazed by this event, Jesus walking on the water, he wants to do it too. So he exits the boat, and then for a little while, Peter is able to stand on the water too, but then Peter is distracted by the storm, the things that are going on around him, and he takes his focus off of Jesus and begins to fall into that water. But then he calls for help, and Jesus reaches out and grabs his hand and pulls him up. And then Jesus asks them about their faith. Where is your faith? You of little faith. Well, of course, the faith was little. No one had seen anybody walking on the water before. No one had seen the feeding the 5,000s before either. So Jesus clearly has set a pattern of coming to people, sharing things, giving things, enlightening people in ways that previously had been unimaginable. So I want to segue now to talk about grief and loss. Joseph's brothers were grieving the loss of the love of their father, because all the love went to Joseph. Joseph, we know, must have been grieving the loss of the position that he had in his family at being beloved by his father Jacob, and suddenly carried into a situation that is unknown. Jesus is mourning the loss of his cousin, John the Baptist. We all, throughout the globe, are mourning a loss that is attributed to being in a long season that's not having any end in sight by COVID-19. Grief is real. At any given moment in time, within ourselves, within other people, are the stages of grief. Denial. This can't be true. We see that quite often, people denying that COVID-19 is a real virus that has killed thousands of people, made others sick. There are people who are angry, and rightfully so, angry because they've lost employment, they've lost their livelihood, school systems, educators, staff, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, parents have lost what they have known to be true and almost set in stone year after year. This is how it works. Suddenly things have changed. Then there's the bargaining phase. If I do this, then things will be different. I'll do that. Sometimes the bargaining is with God. Then, do this, God, then, have mercy, grant some sort of change. Then there's the depression, falling into a pit of sorrow and despair. And then finally, there is acceptance of the reality in which we're in. I think it's important to consider that these phases of grief come in no particular order, yet and still consider that they are always there, that your family and friends and strangers you may engage with at any given point in time again, are experiencing the phases of grief. So we're called to extend generosity and grace to one another during this peculiar time. We've been pulled down into a pit, sometimes feeling like we have no water, like Joseph had no water. We feel like we're like the disciples in a boat battered by the storm, the wind, the rain, perhaps even lightning, and uncertain of what's happening. We may feel like we're like Peter. We thought our faith was steady and sure, but then suddenly we feel that we're losing our faith and falling in to the water. But do not fear. Jesus says, I am with you. The Ishmaelites came along and lifted up Joseph to take him to another place. Peter stretches out his hand to take the hand of Jesus. So we think about the song, Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Precious Lord, take my hand and lead me on. So we know that we're going to sing this song in just a minute, but I want to encourage you to reach out and take the hand of Jesus when you're feeling a little bit depressed, angry, in denial, false acceptance. Reach out and touch the hand of Jesus. And Jesus will lead you home, will lift you up out of the despair and give you the courage and fortitude and hope needed to move forward in these uncertain times. So I invite you to turn to Precious Lord in your worship bulletin at this time, and let us sing together, joining Anson and Stephen.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the long, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me on. When my way grows dreary, precious Lord, linger near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call, hold my hand lest I fall. Take my hand, the precious Lord, lead me on. When the dawn is apace and the night draws near, and the day is past and gone, at the river I stand, guide my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, the precious Lord, lead
Let us say amen. Precious Lord, take our hands and lead us on.